The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Bridgeport's downtown streets as Officer Greg Matt slouched in his patrol car, one arm draped carelessly over the steering wheel. His eyes swept across the bustling sidewalks with the practiced scrutiny of someone who had spent 15 years watching this same stretch of concrete. The familiar weight of his badge pressed against his chest, a constant reminder of the authority it represented. Through the windshield, he observed the usual Friday crowd. Office workers hurrying home, teenagers congregating around the corner store, and tourists consulting their phones for directions. Greg took pride in knowing every inch of his beat, every face that belonged, and, more importantly to him, those that didn't. He'd earned his reputation as one of the most vigilant officers in the precinct, though his methods often drew sideways glances from newer recruits. The aroma of fresh coffee drifted through his partly open window as the door to Riverside Cafe swung open. Greg's attention immediately locked onto the woman who emerged, her presence commanding the sidewalk in a way that made his jaw clench involuntarily. She was tall, dressed in a crisp navy pantsuit that probably cost more than his monthly salary, with natural hair styled in neat, professional twists. Something about her bearing, the straight spine, the purposeful stride, the way she carried her leather briefcase, struck him as presumptuous. Greg's fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he watched her check her watch and begin walking down Marshall Street. In his mind, the familiar cascade of assumptions began. How could she afford that suit? Why was she in this neighborhood? What was she really up to? The questions weren't new. They were the same ones that had guided his policing for years, though he'd learned to couch them in more acceptable terms during departmental reviews. The woman unknown to Greg as Captain Larissa Harris, recently promoted and transferred from the department's Eastern Division, continued down the sidewalk, her heels clicking steadily against the pavement. She was reviewing her mental checklist for her first day as precinct captain tomorrow, considering how to best introduce herself to her new team. The weight of responsibility sat comfortably on her shoulders, earned through 20 years of exemplary service and countless obstacles overcome. Behind her, Greg's patrol car pulled away from the curb. He'd made his decision the moment she'd emerged from the cafe, though he would later struggle to articulate exactly what had prompted his actions. Was it the confidence in her walk? The way she seemed so at ease in a neighborhood where he felt she didn't belong? Or was it simply the chance to remind someone, anyone, of his authority on these streets? The late afternoon traffic moved sluggishly through the intersection, giving Greg time to observe her more closely as he paralleled her path. She turned briefly at the sound of his engine, a flicker of recognition crossing her face at the sight of the patrol car, but nothing more. The lack of concern, of deference, only served to heighten his agitation. Greg had spent years cultivating a certain image on these streets. He was the one people noticed, the one they stepped aside for, the one whose presence commanded respect, or at least fear. This woman's indifference to his marked patrol car felt like a personal affront, a challenge to the careful hierarchy he'd constructed in his mind. The sun dipped behind the city's tallest buildings, casting strange shadows across the street. The woman, Larissa, paused at a crosswalk, checking her phone briefly before continuing her journey. She was thinking about her sister's advice from their conversation last night. Remember, some of them won't be ready for you. Don't let that stop you from being exactly who you are. Greg watched her turn onto Cedar Street, a quieter thoroughfare lined with small businesses preparing to close for the day. The street was emptier here, the foot traffic thinning as people headed home or toward the more popular entertainment districts. A perfect spot, he decided, to remind someone of the natural order of things. He pulled his car to the curb, keeping his movements deliberate and unhurried. Through the years, Greg had developed a certain choreography to these encounters. The casual exit from his vehicle, the measured approach, the carefully calibrated tone that could shift from professional to threatening in an instant. It was a dance he'd performed countless times, one that usually ended with his subject appropriately cowed and his authority reinforced. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, straightening his uniform with practiced precision, Greg failed to notice several things. The security cameras outside the bank across the street, the couple slowing their pace to watch the scene unfold, and most importantly, the department-issued phone in Larissa's hand, already recording as she sensed his approach. These details would become crucial later, but for now, they were lost in the fog of Greg's certainty, his absolute conviction that he was about to put someone in their proper place. The last rays of sunlight caught the gold of his badge as he moved to intercept her, unaware that he was walking directly into a moment that would shatter every assumption he'd built his career upon. The street held its breath, witnesses to the imminent collision of power and prejudice, authority and justice, ignorance and truth. Little did Greg know that his carefully constructed world was about to crumble, beginning with the next few steps he would take on that ordinary Friday afternoon. The woman he was approaching wasn't just another target for his misplaced authority. She was about to become the catalyst for his long-overdue reckoning with reality. "Excuse me, ma'am." Greg's voice cut through the evening air, carrying the false courtesy he'd perfected over years of similar confrontations. Larissa turned, her movement fluid and controlled, revealing nothing of the instant assessment she was making of the situation. Her years of experience had taught her to read these moments quickly. The officer's stance, the placement of his hands, the subtle signs of aggression masked beneath a veneer of professionalism. "Yes, officer." Her response was measured, pitched perfectly between respect for the uniform and self-assured dignity. She'd navigated countless similar interactions throughout her career, though usually from the other side of the badge. The irony wasn't lost on her. Greg stepped closer, invading her personal space with practiced intimidation. "I couldn't help but notice you seem a bit out of place in this neighborhood. Mind telling me what brings you here?" His tone carried the weight of countless unchallenged assumptions, each word laden with implications he'd never been forced to examine. Around them, the street had grown quieter, as if the very air was holding its breath. A young couple across the street had stopped walking, the woman already pulling out her phone. In a nearby storefront, an elderly shopkeeper paused in the act of lowering his security gate, eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. "I'm heading to a meeting," Larissa replied, maintaining eye contact while keeping her hands visible, a habit born from years of training others in proper procedure. "Is there a specific reason you've stopped me, officer?" Her eyes flicked to his nameplate. "Matt?" The use of his name jarred Greg, disrupting his usual script. People he stopped weren't supposed to ask questions or speak his name. They were supposed to stammer, apologize, submit. His jaw tightened, and he shifted his weight forward, using his height to loom over her. "I'll ask the questions here. Let's see some ID." Larissa nodded slowly, her right hand moving deliberately toward her briefcase. "Of course. I'm going to reach for my identification now." Her calm professionalism only served to further agitate Greg, whose world operated on fear and submission, not composed cooperation. "Just hurry up," he snapped, his hand moving to rest on his holster, an unconscious gesture that spoke volumes about his state of mind. The movement didn't go unnoticed by Larissa, whose tactical training had taught her to spot such tells, nor by the growing number of onlookers, several of whom now had their phones raised. As Larissa began to open her briefcase, Greg's patience, already stretched thin by her composed demeanor, snapped. Later, he would struggle to explain what exactly triggered him. Was it the unhurried nature of her movements? The lack of fear in her eyes? Or was it simply the accumulated weight of seeing someone who defied every stereotype he relied upon to navigate his world? Without warning, his hand shot out, grabbing her arm roughly. The briefcase clattered to the ground, its contents spilling across the sidewalk. "I said hurry up." His voice had lost all pretense of professionalism now. Raw with an anger, he couldn't quite understand himself. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for the gathered witnesses. Greg's free hand formed a fist, driven by years of unchecked power and unconscious bias. The punch connected with Larissa's jaw, the impact echoing in the suddenly silent street. Several gasps rose from the crowd, followed by the unmistakable sounds of multiple people dialing their phones. Larissa stumbled, but didn't fall. Years of defensive training kicked in, allowing her to absorb and redirect the force of the blow. As she straightened, wiping a small trickle of blood from her lip, her eyes met Greg's with a clarity that made him take an involuntary step back. Officer Matt, she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of command that had earned her every promotion in her career. I am Captain Larissa Harris, your new commanding officer effective tomorrow morning. She reached down, retrieving her dropped credentials from among the scattered papers. Though given your actions today, I doubt you'll be wearing that badge long enough to serve under my command. The color drained from Greg's face as she held up her police ID, the gold captain's badge gleaming in the fading light. The authority he had wrapped around himself like armor began to crack and fall away, leaving him exposed in the harsh reality of what he had just done. Around them, the crowd had grown larger, their phones capturing every moment of his downfall. The young couple who had first stopped to watch were now speaking rapidly into their phones, reporting the incident to 911. The elderly shopkeeper had emerged fully from his store, shaking his head in disgust at what he'd witnessed. Larissa touched her jaw gently, assessing the damage while maintaining eye contact with Greg. Her next words were delivered with the kind of quiet authority that made them carry far more weight than any shout could have achieved. You just assaulted a superior officer in full view of multiple witnesses, Officer Matt. An action that, I might add, appears to have been motivated by nothing more than your own prejudices. Greg's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The familiar scripts he'd relied on throughout his career, about feeling threatened, about suspicious behavior, about reasonable force, all crumbled in the face of what he had actually done. The security cameras had caught everything. The witnesses had recorded everything. There would be no report to twist, no narrative to construct that could justify punching an unarmed woman who had been calmly complying with his demands. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Greg's world had shifted on its axis, and he was only beginning to understand how completely he had destroyed everything he had spent his career building. The badge that had given him such confidence moments ago now felt like a lead weight against his chest. Larissa pulled out her phone, already dialing as she maintained her commanding presence. This is Captain Harris requesting additional units at Cedar Street between 5th and 6th Avenue. I need a supervisor on scene immediately. Her voice was steady, professional, showing no sign of the impact that had rocked her moments ago. Be advised, I am pressing charges against one of our officers for assault. The words hit Greg like physical blows. Each one stripped away another layer of the protection he had thought his badge provided. The sirens were very close now, and he could see the flash of red and blue lights reflecting off the buildings around them. His future was dissolving before his eyes, and for the first time in his career, he had no power to stop it. The wail of sirens grew to a crescendo as 3 patrol cars converged on the scene, their lights painting the gathering dusk in alternating flashes of red and blue. Greg stood rooted to the spot, his universe contracting to this single moment, this irreversible point of no return. Each flash of light seemed to illuminate another piece of his crumbling reality. Sergeant James Parker was the first to exit his vehicle, his 25 years of experience evident in his swift assessment of the scene. His eyes moved from the gathering crowd with their raised phones, to Greg's rigid stance, to Larissa's commanding presence despite the visible mark on her jaw. Parker had responded to countless calls throughout his career, but the sight of a fellow officer's apparent assault on an unknown woman sent a chill through his seasoned bones. What's the situation here? Parker's authoritative voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. Before Greg could even attempt to formulate a response, Larissa stepped forward, her badge catching the light of the street lamps that had begun to flicker to life. Sergeant Parker, she began, her tone carrying the weight of command that made Parker straighten instinctively. I'm Captain Larissa Harris, transferring in from Eastern Division. Officer Matt here decided to conduct an unauthorized stop, which escalated to him physically assaulting me when I was complying with his request for identification. She gestured to the scattered contents of her briefcase, still strewn across the sidewalk. Multiple witnesses recorded the incident, and I believe the bank security cameras caught everything as well. Parker's expression shifted from professional concern to barely contained shock as he processed her words. His gaze snapped to Greg, who seemed to shrink under the scrutiny of his longtime colleague. Matt, Parker's voice was heavy with disbelief. Is this true? Greg's mouth worked silently, his mind racing through possible explanations, justifications, excuses, but finding none that could withstand the weight of recorded evidence and numerous witnesses. The carefully constructed narrative he might have created in the past about feeling threatened or suspecting criminal activity dissolved in the face of reality. He had assaulted an unarmed woman who turned out to be his superior officer. I didn't know. He finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. You didn't know she was a captain, Larissa interjected, her voice sharp with authority. Would that have made a difference, Officer Matt? Would you have treated any civilian with more respect if they wore a badge? Or is it only the prospect of consequences that concerns you now? The gathered crowd had grown larger, their phones still recording every moment of Greg's downfall. Among them, the young couple who had witnessed the initial confrontation were now giving their statements to one of the responding officers. The elderly shopkeeper had emerged fully from his store, speaking rapidly to another officer and gesturing toward his own security cameras. Parker turned to two officers who had arrived with him, officers who had shared countless shifts with Greg over the years. Officers Johnson and Rivera, please secure Officer Matt's weapon and take him into custody. His voice carried the heavy resignation of someone who had seen too many good careers end through poor choices. The process of disarming a fellow officer was something rarely practiced outside of training scenarios, and the weight of the moment was evident in Johnson and Rivera's careful movements. Greg offered no resistance as they removed his service weapon, his handcuffs, his badge, each item representing another piece of his identity being stripped away. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Greg finally found his voice again. Captain, I didn't mean to... But Larissa held up a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. Save it for your statement, Officer Matt. You'll have plenty of time to explain your actions to Internal Affairs. Her words carried no anger, no satisfaction at his downfall, only the steady certainty of justice being served. The crowd had begun to thin, though many lingered to capture these final moments of Greg's public humiliation. Some were already posting their videos to social media, ensuring that his actions would live far beyond this evening. The narrative was already forming online. Racist cop assaults new black female captain, immediately faces consequences. Parker approached Larissa, his demeanor professional but apologetic. Captain Harris, we'll need your formal statement. Would you prefer to do that here or at the station? The station, she replied firmly. I want everything done by the book. Officer Matt's actions tonight aren't just about me. They're symptomatic of larger issues that need to be addressed. She paused, touching her jaw again. And I should probably have this looked at by the paramedics first. As if on cue, an ambulance pulled up quietly, its lights flashing but siren silent. The paramedics emerged with practiced efficiency, their presence adding another layer of official documentation to the evening's events. Each photograph they took of Larissa's injury, each note they made in their report, was another nail in the coffin of Greg's career. From the back of the patrol car, where Johnson and Rivera had placed him, Greg watched through the window as his world continued to unravel. The captain he had assaulted was now speaking calmly with Parker, likely outlining the changes she would implement to prevent similar incidents in the future. His former colleagues moved around the scene with professional detachment, processing it like any other crime scene, because that's what it was now. His actions had transformed this familiar street corner from his domain into the site of his greatest failure. The gravity of his situation began to sink in fully. This wasn't just about losing his job. He was facing criminal charges, public scrutiny, and the destruction of his reputation. Every assumption he had relied upon, every bias he had never questioned, every abuse of power he had justified to himself. All of it was now laid bare under the unforgiving lights of justice. As the patrol car pulled away from the scene, Greg caught one last glimpse of Captain Harris in his side mirror. She stood straight and composed, already embodying the leadership role she would assume tomorrow, despite, or perhaps because of, the events of this evening. In that moment, Greg finally began to understand the true measure of authority, not in the power to intimidate or control, but in the strength to maintain dignity and justice even in the face of unwarranted violence. The car turned a corner, and the scene disappeared from view, but its implications would echo through the department and the community for months to come. This Friday evening had marked not just the end of Greg's career, but the beginning of a necessary transformation in the culture of law enforcement in Bridgeport. And it had all started with a single moment of unchecked prejudice meeting unwavering professionalism. The city lights blurred past the wind, as Greg was driven toward his new reality, each street taking him further from the power he had abused and closer to the consequences he had never thought he would face. In the growing darkness, the weight of his actions pressed against him like a physical presence, heavier than any badge he had ever worn. Through the patrol car's window, the streetlights merged into a continuous stream of light and shadow as Greg was transported to the station he had left just hours ago as a respected officer. Each familiar landmark they passed seemed to mock him now. The corner store where he'd gotten his morning coffee, the crosswalk where he'd helped schoolchildren cross, the park where he'd broken up countless teenage gatherings. Places that had once been symbols of his authority now stood as silent witnesses to his fall from grace. The booking process at the station felt surreal, like watching himself in a bizarre dream. Officers he'd worked with for years now processed him with professional detachment, their faces carefully neutral as they took his fingerprints and mugshot. The flash of the camera seemed especially bright, immortalizing the moment when Officer Greg Matt became just another perpetrator in the system. Sergeant Parker stood in the doorway of the processing room, his presence a reminder of better days now irretrievably lost. The weight of disappointment in his mentor's eyes was almost worse than the handcuffs that had only recently been removed. When Parker finally spoke, his voice carried the heavy burden of someone who had seen too many good officers lose their way. "I've known you for 15 years, Matt," Parker said, closing the door behind him. 15 years of watching you work, training you, trusting you to uphold our badge's honor. What happened out there today?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Greg slumped in the hard plastic chair, his uniform now feeling like a costume he had no right to wear. "I don't know, Sarge," he mumbled, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. He did know. He had always known, but had never been forced to confront the ugly truth about his own prejudices until now. "That's not good enough," Parker replied, his voice sharp with controlled anger. "Captain Harris could have been anyone, a lawyer, a doctor, a teacher. The fact that she turned out to be your superior officer doesn't change the fundamental wrong of what you did. You assaulted an unarmed civilian who was complying with your requests. That's not policing, Matt. That's abuse of power." The words hit Greg like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the justifications he'd built up over years of unchecked behavior. Through the window of the processing room, he could see other officers gathering in the bullpen, their hushed conversations and furtive glances making it clear that news of his actions had spread quickly. Officer Sarah Chun, a rookie he'd trained just 6 months ago, walked past the window with a stack of papers, deliberately avoiding eye contact. The sight struck him particularly hard. He remembered telling her that authority came from projection of power, from making people respect the badge. Now he wondered how many other young officers he had poisoned with his twisted perspective. The station's atmosphere had changed palpably since his arrival. Where once his presence had commanded respect and camaraderie, now there was only tense silence and averted gazes. Officers who had laughed at his jokes that morning now moved past the processing room with purposeful strides, their faces set in masks of professional indifference. Through the glass, he caught glimpses of Captain Harris as she moved through the station, already commanding respect without raising her voice or resorting to intimidation. Several officers gathered around her, their body language showing genuine attention and respect rather than the fear-based deference Greg had, always mistaken for authority. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention back to the immediate situation. 2 internal affairs investigators entered the room, their presence marking the official beginning of what would undoubtedly be a thorough investigation into not just tonight's incident, but his entire career. Their faces were unfamiliar, a deliberate choice, he realized, to ensure impartiality. "Officer Matt," the older investigator began, placing a recorder on the table between them. We need to take your statement about the events that occurred this evening on Cedar Street. Before we begin, you have the right to have your union representative present. Do you understand these rights?" Greg nodded mechanically, the familiar words now directed at him instead of countless suspects he had processed over the years. The younger investigator pressed the record button, the small red light serving as another reminder of how completely his world had changed in the space of a few hours. "Please state your name and badge number for the record," the investigator prompted, and Greg's voice cracked as he responded with information he had once stated with pride. Now each word felt like an admission of guilt, a reminder of the trust he had betrayed. As the questioning began, Greg found himself struggling to explain his actions in a way that wouldn't reveal the deep-seated prejudices that had driven them. But with each attempt at justification, each carefully worded explanation, he could see the investigator's expressions grow more skeptical. The security camera footage and witness videos had captured everything. There would be no hiding behind carefully constructed reports or selective memory this time. Outside the processing room, life at the precinct continued. Officers came and went, reports were filed, calls were answered. But nothing would ever be quite the same. His actions had not only ended his own career, but had forced a moment of reckoning for the entire department. In the coming days, weeks, and months, every interaction, every arrest, every use of force would be scrutinized through the lens of what had happened on Cedar Street. The investigation stretched into the late hours of the night. Greg's union representative arrived, looking tired and resigned, offering legal advice that seemed hollow in the face of such clear evidence. Each question from the investigators peeled back another layer of Greg's professional facade, revealing the rot that had been growing beneath the surface of his badge. Through the window, he watched as the shift changed, day turning to night, turning to early morning. Officers he had worked with for years clocked out, some pausing to stare at the processing room before shaking their heads and leaving. Each departing face carried a mix of emotions: disappointment, anger, perhaps even a touch of self-reflection about their own conduct. Captain Harris remained in the building long after her scheduled departure time, already taking command of the situation with a quiet authority that made Greg's aggressive displays of power seem all the more shameful by comparison. He watched as she spoke with officers, reviewed procedures, and began the process of healing the wounds his actions had inflicted on the department's reputation. As midnight approached, Greg sat alone in the holding cell, his uniform replaced with standard-issue prison garments. The metal bench was uncomfortable, but he barely noticed the physical discomfort through the weight of his thoughts. For the first time in his career, he was forced to confront the reality of what it meant to be on the other side of the law, not as an officer maintaining order, but as someone who had abused his power and was now facing the consequences. The night stretched endlessly before him, each minute bringing new realizations about the magnitude of his mistakes and the ripple effects they would have on his life, his family, and the entire department. Tomorrow, his face would be in the news, his actions dissected by reporters and social media, his career held up as an example of everything wrong with modern policing. But for now, in the quiet of the holding cell, all he could do was wait and reflect on how completely he had destroyed everything he had spent 15 years building. The dawn crept into the holding cell through a narrow window, painting stark shadows across Greg's hunched form. He hadn't slept, the events of the previous day playing on endless repeat in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Each replay brought new insights, new shame, new understanding of just how deeply his prejudices had corrupted his service. The morning shift change brought familiar sounds that now felt alien. The shuffle of boots on linoleum, the squawk of radios, the clink of keys and equipment. Every noise reminded him of the life he'd lost, the career he'd destroyed with a single moment of unchecked bias. The morning briefing would be starting now, he realized, but instead of standing among his fellow officers, he sat in a cell awaiting transfer to county. Captain Harris's voice carried through the corridor, clear and authoritative as she addressed the morning shift. Her words drifted to his cell in fragments. Fundamental changes, accountability, community trust. Each phrase struck him like an indictment of his own failures. She was already implementing the changes he had feared, the very reforms he had privately mocked as unnecessary political correctness. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. Sergeant Parker appeared at the cell door, his face etched with the weight of disappointment. "The transfer vehicle will be here in an hour," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Internal Affairs wants to do one more interview before you go." He paused, studying Greg through the bars. I keep thinking about all the times I should have seen this coming. The small comments, the excessive stops, the complaints I dismissed. I failed as your supervisor, Matt." Greg raised his head, meeting Parker's gaze for the first time since his arrest. "No, Sarge. I failed. I failed everything the badge stands for." The words felt foreign in his mouth. Truth instead of the defensive posturing he was accustomed to. Down the hall, the morning shift was dispersing to their assignments. Greg could hear Captain Harris giving specific instructions to officers, her leadership style already evident in the way she balanced authority with respect. The contrast with his own approach to power couldn't have been more stark. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of the Internal Affairs investigators, accompanied by his union representative who looked even more exhausted than the previous night. They set up in the interview room, the familiar space now feeling hostile and foreign from this side of the table. "Officer Matt," the lead investigator began, then caught himself. "Mr. Matt, we've reviewed the security footage from multiple angles, along with witness statements and social media videos. We need to discuss your history of civilian complaints, particularly those involving racial bias." Greg's stomach churned as they began laying out file after file. Complaints he'd dismissed, incidents he'd justified, patterns he'd refused to acknowledge. Each case now seemed to form part of an undeniable trajectory leading to yesterday's assault. The morning sun streaming through the window illuminated the stack of papers, years of misconduct documented in black and white. "There's a clear pattern here," the investigator continued, his tone professional but uncompromising. "Multiple complaints of excessive force, particularly against minorities. Discriminatory language noted by fellow officers, but never formally reported. Disproportionate stop and frisk statistics in your patrol area." Outside the interview room, life at the precinct continued its new normal. Greg could see officers adapting to Captain Harris's leadership style, the subtle shifts in behavior and attitude already taking hold. The morning's patrol briefing had included a new section on community engagement and bias recognition. Changes that would have prompted eye rolls and resistance just yesterday. The questioning continued for hours, each new topic revealing another layer of his professional failures. The investigators were thorough, methodical, piecing together a picture of systematic bias that Greg could no longer deny. His union representative sat largely silent, occasionally offering legal advice that seemed increasingly futile in the face of such overwhelming evidence. Through the window, he watched Captain Harris conducting a training session in the main conference room. Officers who had once responded to his aggressive style with nervous compliance now engaged actively with her, their body language relaxed but attentive. She was building something new on the ruins of the old system, a department based on respect rather than fear, service rather than power. The arrival of the transfer vehicle marked the end of his time at the precinct. As he was led through the building in handcuffs, officers he'd worked with for years turned away or watched in silence. His walk of shame took him past his old desk, now being cleared by administrative staff, past the break room where he'd shared countless coffees and complaints, past the bulletin board where his face would soon appear in a very different context. Captain Harris stood in her office doorway as he passed, her expression neither triumphant nor angry, just resolute. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Greg saw not the woman he had assaulted yesterday, but the leader he could have served under, the change he had fought so hard to prevent. The sunlight outside was harsh after hours in the interview room. News vans had gathered at the station entrance, cameras ready to capture his downfall for the evening news. As he was led to the transfer vehicle, Greg caught fragments of reporters' questions. History of racial bias, departmental changes, systematic reform. The vehicle's door closed with a heavy finality, sealing him into a small compartment that represented his new reality. Through the window, he watched his former workplace recede, each foot of distance carrying him further from the power he had abused and closer to the consequences he had earned. In his absence, he knew Captain Harris would continue the work of transformation. She would implement the changes he had resisted, build the bridges he had burned, create the department he had feared. His own story would become a cautionary tale, a case study in the consequences of unchecked authority and institutionalized bias. The city streets rolled past the window, familiar corners and landmarks now viewed from a very different perspective. Pedestrians turned to watch the vehicle pass, perhaps wondering about its occupant. Unaware, they were witnessing the transport of a former officer who had finally been held accountable for his actions. Greg leaned his head against the cool metal wall, closing his eyes against the morning sun. The weight of his choices pressed against him, heavier than any burden he'd carried in 15 years of service. His uniform, his badge, his authority, all stripped away, leaving only the raw truth of who he was and what he had done. The transfer vehicle turned onto the highway, carrying him toward the county facility where he would await trial. Behind him, the department would continue its transformation under Captain Harris's leadership. His own journey of reckoning was just beginning, a long path of confronting his biases, acknowledging his failures, and perhaps, eventually, finding a way to make amends for the damage he had caused. The city skyline disappeared in the rearview mirror, taking with it the last vestiges of his old life. Ahead lay uncertainty, accountability, and the harsh reality of justice served not by force, but by the very system he had sworn to uphold. The irony was not lost on him as the vehicle continued its journey, carrying him toward a future he had never imagined for himself, but one he had earned with every abuse of power, every unchecked bias, every moment of unacknowledged privilege. The county correctional facility loomed before him, its stark walls and razor wire a far cry from the familiar comfort of his patrol car. As the transfer vehicle passed through the security gates, each mechanical click and buzz marked another step in Greg's transition from law enforcer to lawbreaker. The processing was methodical, impersonal, a system he had once been part of now processing him with the same detached efficiency he had shown countless others. 3 months later, Greg sat in the sterile confines of his mandatory counseling session, the court-appointed therapist's office a stark contrast to the holding cells he'd grown accustomed to. Dr. Sarah Martinez sat across from him, her notepad balanced on her knee, her expression neutral but engaged as she listened to him struggle through another session of confronting his deeply rooted biases. "Tell me about your first week on the force," she prompted, her voice carrying neither judgment nor sympathy. It was a question she'd asked before, but today, after weeks of therapy and self-reflection, Greg found himself seeing those memories through a different lens. "I was so proud," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "The badge, the uniform, they meant something to me then, or at least I thought they did." He paused, running his hands over his face, the gesture revealing the tremor he'd developed since his arrest. "But looking back now, I realize I was proud of the power, not the responsibility. I saw authority as control, not service." Outside the office window, autumn leaves scattered across the parking lot. Greg watched them dance in the wind, remembering countless fall days spent patrolling the streets of Bridgeport. Each memory now came with a new weight, a deeper understanding of how his actions had affected the community he'd sworn to protect. "Last night, I couldn't sleep," he continued, surprising himself with the admission. "I kept thinking about this traffic stop I made maybe 5 years ago. Young black woman, professional type, driving a nice car. I told myself I pulled her over for a broken taillight, but that wasn't true. I pulled her over because I didn't think she belonged in that neighborhood, in that car." He swallowed hard. "Just like Captain Harris didn't belong on that sidewalk in my mind." Dr. Martinez made a note, her pen scratching quietly against the paper. "And how do you feel about that incident now?" "Ashamed," Greg replied immediately, the word coming easier now after months of therapy. "But more than that, I feel responsible. Not just for that stop or what I did to Captain Harris, but for every time I abuse my authority. Every person I made feel small or scared or less than human. I carried those prejudices like armor, used him to justify everything I did wrong. Meanwhile, across town at the Bridgeport Police Department, Captain Harris's influence had begun to show results. The precinct's complaint statistics had dropped significantly, while community engagement numbers were at an all-time high. Her leadership style, once feared by officers like Greg as too soft, had proven more effective than years of aggressive policing. Greg learned about these changes through newspaper articles and court-mandated reports. Each success story from his former precinct served as both a reminder of his failures and a glimpse of what proper policing could achieve. The department's transformation under Captain Harris became a national model for police reform, while his case was cited in training programs as an example of the consequences of unchecked bias. Back in therapy, Greg continued to unpack decades of ingrained PR. Prejudice. Yesterday, I read about a community outreach program the department started, he told Dr. Martinez. Officers having coffee with residents, attending neighborhood meetings, building real relationships. When I was on the force, I would have called that a waste of time. Now I understand. That's what real police work should be. The sessions were challenging, often leaving him emotionally drained. But slowly, painfully, Greg began to recognize the patterns that had led to his downfall. He saw how each small act of bias, each moment of unchecked power, had built upon the others until violence became his default response to any perceived challenge to his authority. The hardest part, he admitted during one particularly difficult session, is knowing that I can't undo what I did. I can't go back and change all those interactions, all those times I made someone feel powerless or afraid. Captain Harris was just the last in a long line of people I wronged, but she was the one who finally held me accountable. As winter approached, Greg's legal proceedings continued. His guilty plea had been accepted, but sentencing was still pending. His lawyer had advised him that his cooperation with therapy and genuine signs of reformation might influence the judge's decision. But Greg found himself less concerned with the length of his sentence than with the work of understanding and changing himself. The therapy office became a space of uncomfortable truths and painful realizations. Each session peeled back another layer of justification, revealing the raw prejudices beneath. Dr. Martinez guided him through the process with professional detachment, helping him confront the root causes of his behavior without excusing any of his actions. I keep thinking about my rookie partner, Greg said during one session, staring out at the winter sky. Sarah Chun. I taught her that respect comes from fear, that authority means control. I poisoned her view of what police work should be, just like someone poisoned mine when I was starting out. It's like a virus, passing from one generation of officers to the next. But Chun, he learned, had thrived under Captain Harris's leadership. She'd become one of the department's most effective community liaison officers. Her approach to policing transformed by the new culture of respect and accountability. The knowledge brought Greg both shame and hope. Shame for the harmful lessons he'd tried to teach her, hope that the cycle could be broken. The television in the therapy office waiting room often played news coverage of the department's reforms. Greg would catch glimpses of Captain Harris speaking at press conferences, her presence commanding respect without intimidation. She had become the face of progressive policing in Bridgeport, her handling of his case cited as a turning point in the department's history. I saw her on TV yesterday, he told Dr. Martinez. She was talking about building trust between police and communities of color. All I could think was how close I came to destroying that trust completely. One moment of violence could have undone years of progress. Maybe it did, for some people. The weight of his actions continued to press upon him, but it was different now, less a burden of shame and more a responsibility to change. Each session brought new insights, new understanding of how deeply his prejudices had run and how much work lay ahead in confronting them. Spring arrived, bringing with it Greg's sentencing hearing. As he stood before the judge, he found himself thinking not of the punishment he faced, but of the legacy he had left behind, both the damage he had done and the changes his actions had inadvertently sparked. The courtroom was packed with observers, police reform advocates, department representatives, members of the community he had once policed. Captain Harris sat in the gallery, her presence a reminder of both his crimes and the possibility of transformation. When given the chance to speak, Greg faced them all, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I stand here today, not just as someone who broke the law," he began, "but as someone who betrayed the very principles I swore to uphold. My actions weren't just an assault on Captain Harris. They were an assault on the trust between police and community, on the dignity of every person I ever encountered with prejudice instead of respect. I can't undo that damage, but I can acknowledge it, learn from it, and hopefully help others avoid the same path." The judge's sentence, when it came, seemed almost secondary to the larger punishment of knowing what he had lost, what he had destroyed, and what he had inadvertently helped create. As he was led from the courtroom, Greg caught one final glimpse of Captain Harris. She met his gaze with the same unwavering dignity she had shown that fateful evening on Cedar Street. And in that moment, he understood that his story would always be part of a larger narrative, not just of personal failure and redemption, but of necessary change and institutional transformation.